Hello, my name is Alistair Ballantyne, and you are listening to the Big Soup Podcast. Today, on episode 7, we will be discussing the unfolding and cyclical nature of healing. So many people approach healing as if it was a one and done experience, a box to be checked, a badge to be earned, or something that has to have a metric applied to it that is totally inappropriate for the organic nature of the healing process. Because emphasis on the word process there, my friends, because that is key, because healing is never done. It's always unfolding. You are always integrating something. You're always transforming something. You're always realizing something. I find that it's quite a stark contrast between the people who actually believe and are committed into their own path of healing versus those who say that they've done the work but then tend to come apart at the slightest bit of scrutiny or challenge or something unexpected. It's been a real interesting journey as a spiritual practitioner so far, because I came into this world through the route of music and education and, having spirituality put through different lenses. In my own path, I have experiences of trauma, abuse of different kinds, and all of these different things that I sought conventional therapies and assistance with, and my sense of spiritual awareness and connection acted as a beacon to keep going in those dark times. And I did come pretty close to ultimately choosing to not be here anymore. And there was always something that stopped me going through with it, even in those moments where it seemed like there was no other path to take. Something that really helped me was recognizing that these feelings and experiences and sensations are like waves. The wave will come, it will crest, it will break, and then it will recede. And then naturally, the next wave will carry a little bit of what came before it, but will also have something new. And with each wave, it was an opportunity to make a different choice, even if the choice in that moment was a seemingly micro decision from the outside, or on the inside, it can actually feel like quite a big leap. Now, healing has become a bit of a buzzword, and while it is fantastic that we are having more open conversations about how we can grow and evolve as humans, the things that cause us distress and difficulty, unpicking long-held patterns that we've picked up from society, family, parents, communities, peer groups, friends, all this kind of stuff, it has also become a bit of a trap for people who get stuck in the healing loop, we will refer to that as today, where it just doesn't seem to end. Everything becomes about this very fragile construct of reality that, if anything, challenges that. And what I find interesting with this is, with more conversation comes more awareness. With more awareness comes more room for different ideas and approaches that we can take when it comes to our own healing. But also, I've noticed that there are, I'm going to refer to them as healing holding patterns and healing loops. And with the holding pattern, this one is quite common from my experience, that people will say they've gone on a healing journey, but then suddenly the whole life becomes about avoidance of the things that cause them pain. Not saying that you'd need to go and put your hand in the fire or some kind of mad aversion therapy, but if you are avoiding what it is that has caused difficulty, as I used to do on my path, you aren't really truly able to get out there and live, because you've always got one eye looking out for something that could cause further distress and difficulty. Now, of course, this is very natural if you've had an experience of trauma. I personally have done as well. I'm not on about social media definitions and buzzwords. I'm more so on about the doctor sitting you down and telling you that certain experiences in your life have left a fingerprint in a certain way, and that may very well have altered how you see the world, how you see yourself, and how you respond to different things. That happened when I was 30, 31, thereabouts. And before that, I noticed that throughout my 20s, a lot of the time and energy I spent was on trying to keep myself safe and trying to keep myself in a pattern where the things that have caused pain in the past wouldn't happen again. Now, this is all fair and well and very well intentioned in some aspects, but then in other aspects, it was causing untold problems for relationships, connections, progression in life, progression in my career, because there came a point where it was hard to deny that the past, the shadow of the past, was actively influencing and affecting what I was experiencing in the present and therefore also the future. So if you think that the past casts its shadow, you cannot really shine your light in the present openly and authentically if there are still clouds getting in the way of your sun. Also, it was challenging because when that came to relationships, that would bring me into the orbit of people who mirrored some of the experiences that I'd had, or they reflected certain traits, or ultimately, the worst one was recognizing going through similar experiences as other people, not necessarily the same, but opening up, but bringing us to a similar place. That sense of recognition in one another seeming like, oh, this is a soul connection, whereas really just big old trauma bond, and those things are really difficult to unpick. So when it comes to the discussion of healing, we need to recognize that being in the holding pattern is not healing. It's an avoidance, and you've got to go into the holding pattern sometimes to just kind of recalibrate, find your center, and find a place for you to work from. But ultimately, that has to be progressively moving forward. Then we get onto the healing loops. And healing loops are when people are jumping from modality to modality, doing all of these different things constantly, but they're not actually getting out there and living. I am a believer and an advocate that, yes, we need to engage in periods of healing. And during that period of healing, maybe there's one or two things that you might want to do or focus on. But once that period has passed, which you need to put that definition on yourself, you have to get back out there into the world. You have to find your way. And it is really difficult. We can't be glib about this. We can't gloss over everyone's experience is going to be different. But when we see healing as an unfolding journey and cyclical in nature, it gives us a bit of freedom to experiment and to explore, but also it allows us to give ourselves grace. When we don't give ourselves grace, we end up becoming the warden to our own prison, and that prison is in the mind and the body and the various different things that are interconnected with each other in the human experience. So just as much as the holding pattern is not a good place to be for a long period of time, the loop is an equally bad place to be, because when people jump from modality to modality, from course to course, from retreat to retreat, they are not focusing on the integration. I've seen this a lot. This is something we could draw a parallel with around the discussion of the psychedelics and the very kind of bro thing that's gotten into it, where instead of actually integrating your experiences, you just go and do more, or go and sit in ceremony with the medicine. All right, mate. All of these kind of things, you've got to recognize that these journeys have stepping on and stepping off points. We could see it like taking a journey on a train, but instead of staying on we could see it like taking a train journey, but instead of staying on until you reach your desired destination, you have to get off at every stop. And at every stop, there is something to learn, something to immerse in, something to experience, something to reflect on. And then you get back on the train and keep going. Because ultimately, if we get trapped in the holding pattern and the loop, we are the ones that individually suffer and others benefit. So if you're in the holding pattern and your life's not moving forward, or you feel like you don't have the agency to actually do what needs to be done to drive it forward, whatever or whoever it is that has caused you pain and frustration and the difficulties is out there. They're out there living their lives, and you are stuck in the hole. And that still means that experience has won. That experience has still got its power. when you're in the loop, you're not giving yourself time to integrate your experiences. You're not giving yourself time to actually work with what has been learned, and using practitioners, courses, services, sessions, you name it, as a release valve, rather than recognizing within yourself what needs to be done, what needs to change, what needs to evolve, what needs to integrate, and ultimately what needs to shift. At this point in the human journey, with as connected as we are, we need to have a more responsible use of technology and social media and connection, because people are out there self-diagnosing and thinking that they have got much deeper, further rooted problems than might actually be the case, because they might identify with what someone is saying on social media. But if we zoom out even more, we recognize that a lot of the traumas that people are experiencing are actually systemic in nature. Our society is struggling to maintain itself because our society has not been built on sustainable means. And when it's not built on sustainable means, it ultimately then has to assert itself through force and dominance. And when you are just trying to live and have a good life, I'm not on about ultra wealth or anything like that. I mean, like, have your home, pay your way, make sure food is on the table, and you can do what you want to do, the basics. But it's now almost impossible to do that for someone on a basic income, and you have to have a certain level of resources, or you need to partner up or buddy up with others. We're getting into this place where it feels like we're in a pressure cooker, and in many respects we are. And we can see that in terms of the societal unrest and lack of cohesion. We can also see that in geopolitical situations. Many different issues are facing. We can also see that with the environment and the climate and all of this other kind of stuff. And we're still having people trying to claim airtime to debate whether the world is flat or round. All of this just turning into an absolute wall of noise. 9 out of 10 times, people who are driving the mad things in society are not the kind of people that we should be trusting or listening to. They speak to us through the window of pain. They speak to us through the window of fear, through anger. It becomes very easy to be controlled. So when we recognize that actually everyone needs a bit of healing because the world is messed up, and when we engage in that as a collective, it allows us to make different choices. It allows us to lay foundation stones of different pathways. But we may personally not feel the full benefit of new ideas, structures, and pathways and frameworks in their full realization, because they might take a lot longer to take root and anchor than the actual span of our lives. Now, I'm recording this at the age of 40. I would have definitely had the same opinion at the age of 20, because when we have visions that are world embracing and inclusive and bit more and just generally broader in scope, we recognize that we are part of a bigger chain of process and evolution. So when we see that at the macro level, it kind of makes sense. When we see it in ourselves in a micro level, we can end up with so many disconnects, because the way our world is structured is, it doesn't encourage this kind of self-reflection or this kind of very reflective, nuanced and process-based view of the self. It takes so much of the self-development literature, world podcasts, wellness influencers, all this kind of nonsense that is saying to us that if we're not a fully optimized version of ourselves, there is something wrong. Or if we can't be perfect in every interaction, then we don't deserve to have XYZ thing. The amount of baseline level of anxiety in this world right now is insane. So many people question their own value because it might not be considered valuable by a society that is fetishizing the material, physical experience as the only thing that really matters. So there are many different things here at a structural level that are causing difficulties, are causing problems for so many, that are then being pushed onto us at an individual level as being the bearers of the burden. For example, climate consciousness. We know that it's not really easy to do some digging and see that a lot of the issues with climate and pollution, the man-made side of things, comes at a structural level again, yet we are passed on the burden as individuals, which ultimately, if nothing's happening at a structural level, what we're doing as individuals is not going to truly make enough of a difference to matter. It may help us feel like we're actually doing something and that we have a consciousness that is connected with the earth and the harmony of humanity and nature, which, arguably that is important in itself. But until we see changes in how we produce food, how we ship our goods around the world, and how we, and even like with military force, this kind of thing, using polluting fuels and extractive methods, nothing is really going to change fundamentally. But then approaching the world from a regenerative point of view rather than an extractive point of view is the big debate of the moment, in that you have those with the extractive point of view trying to take us back to the past, and the ones with the regenerative point of view trying to take us into the future. Yet there is such a schism between the two. Many who are, in the middle somewhere, maybe not to the margins or the extremes, are kind of getting lost in the source because they don't feel represented by those who are maybe naturally aligned with them, but in extreme. So there's a few things here that when we recognize that there are structural issues that need healing in society, we also have to heal the part of ourselves that identifies with some of these issues, and also heal the parts of ourselves that has difficulty maybe voicing how we feel or voicing our views, because there's always an army of smooth-brained robo-monkeys ready to jump on anything that anyone says that might be in contrast to a held view. So it's very difficult for us to even have a conversation these days, let alone actually meaningfully affect change. So if that's in the world, what about for us as individuals? The first thing is that our society and ways of living as we know it are not sustainable. So if something is not sustainable and tries to assert its preservation and legitimize itself through force and oppression, we are then told that we have to jump through an increasingly narrow margin and ever-changing set of metrics and values to supposedly be a person of worth in society. So that in itself is going to cause a lot of stress and frustration. We've got people out there podcasting, writing books, giving talks that have got no flipping idea about humanity and are encouraging people to make all of these crazy decisions about their lives and adopt crazy views and crazy ways of engaging with others because it maybe drives clicks to their platform, whether people are like, oh yeah, that's so true, or they're just there out of outrage. I think personally we should throw them all in the bin. One of the reasons that I started this podcast was to try and do something positive, try and put something out there that's helpful and useful, even if at times it does get a little bit shaky fist and all of that, because that's necessary. It's necessary when it is done in a way that is progressive and constructive, at least in terms of me and my own standards and how I want to conduct myself. That's the main thing. But there's so many folks out there that, they've not gone to therapy themselves. They haven't done any self-reflective work. They're viewing people as machines and are advising people to treat themselves like machines, and are approaching problems that are nuanced with a very black and white view. It doesn't help that a lot of human interaction has been reduced to podcast talking points, whether that is the righteousness of stupidity, the righteousness of self, or just an overall sense of righteousness, which is a load of crap anyway. But seeing yourself as above others and demanding that other people bow down to you is one of the symptoms of a society and culture that is collapsing in on itself. So if we don't want to get pulled in down that plug hole through the vortex, we have to start unpicking and undoing a lot of the conditioning process. And one of those things is seeing healing as linear. I've been to therapy, I think probably 6 or 7 times since the age of 15. And I don't mean in like, oh, I've just been for like 6 or 7 sessions. I mean like courses of therapy designed to work on specific aspects and situations and issues that I've experienced or have carried with me over that sort of 25-year period of time. I have always been very committed to trying to be the best version of myself that I can be. And if I've ever found myself in a situation where I've exhibited behavior that I don't agree with, or I've responded to a situation or conducted myself towards a person that is not right, in my view, I will then enter into one of these processes again. And I think that that's important because, like we were talking in the last episode about self accountability, when we take the accountability for ourselves and our own behaviors, we are going to have to unpick stuff. We are going to have to look at things that were maybe accepted or normal when we were younger that are now not at all. And that's a very difficult sticking point because personally, I don't think people can change overnight. And I don't think anyone has the right to kind of click their fingers and demand other people change, because it's not just like installing a software upgrade on your computer. You have to unlearn and relearn, and then you also have to deal with the feelings and the emotions that are surrounded that, any guilt, shame, self-blame, all of these things, because throughout human history, ideas and values have shifted a lot. And even now, the more access we have to information and connection with one another, values are shifting quite dramatically, quite quickly. So it's not an isolated experience for anyone to really have to look at themselves and go, yeah, maybe that's not okay. Maybe that's not a helpful way to see the world. Maybe that's not a constructive way to see others. Maybe that's not the best way to conduct myself. And it's interesting when there's pushback against a public figure or an ideology. And if the public figure responds to that with the position of accountability and contrition and recognizing that they have got work to do and they can't undo what has been done already, but try to find ways to make it right, that shows that there is window for evolution. There is openness for a progressive discussion. There is a sense of a desire to actually want to do right. If someone pushes back, denies all accountability, points their finger at everyone else except themselves, and makes a hell of a noise to try and distract what's actually going on that puts them under the spotlight in a way that they don't like, then we know that there is a real problem there, and that person has got no interest in evolution. They've only got an interest in how other people perceive them. Now, I find this quite interesting because when it comes to the healing process, people who are more concerned about how they are perceived are more likely to see healing as a one and done journey. I remember when I started advertising, group sessions and classes, I had some people who were fellow practitioners going, "Oh, that's nice. I've already done that though, so I don't need to do it again." And I'm like, well, that tells me that you're bullshitting yourself. Not that I want them to come to my session, but it was more a concern of, okay, cool. I know that life is going to throw something at you where it's going to test that theory and that position. Because I don't know about you, but the minute I've ever claimed that, I've learned that lesson, I've done that, something will come up to essentially test that and be like, are you sure, young man? Are you sure you have learned this lesson? How do you feel about this? How do you feel about that? And if you can get through those experiences without responding and reacting in the way that you would have done before, then yeah, maybe you have. But the funny thing is when I think specifically about those people who claimed to have done these things before or didn't need to learn those things, I saw evidence on their socials within weeks that that was not true. Not to, laugh at anyone or anything like that. This is more about just be careful what you say, because we live in a responsive universe. We live in an alive experience. So things will respond to what we put out there, and we kind of look at things in a way through that lens. that ultimately will define, do we need to keep working on this particular aspect of self, or are we integrated within that, and can we move on to that next stage and layer of the unfolding process? So again, this is another place where, healing and spirituality has become quite dogmatic, especially with like leveled and layered certifications and qualifications and all of these bits and things that will supposedly say that you're at a certain stage of the journey, rather than recognizing that you can find and define your own path through all of this. So one of the weird experiences I had, this is when I was in this online cult-like group based around business and all of these kind of things. We were encouraged to sort of stir the pot and create controversy online. What a load of nonsense that was. But there was one time I shared something about men not being able to talk about mental health and anxiety and this kind of thing. And it's an important conversation to have, because if we're going to create equality, we need to also recognize where the structure has failed people who have benefited from the structure so far. So encouraging men to be more self-reflective, develop their EQ, and express themselves in a way that is constructive, particularly when it comes to the realm of emotion, is something that I think is very important personally, because a lot of the issues that we have on our planet are because men are not encouraged to develop emotional structure. Look at how a lot of the regressive minded talking head influencer types completely crash out when their views are challenged, and they claim to be super logical and above the emotional thing, and then go on the most unhinged, emotionally reactive things. And then, of course, the great irony is you'll have people claiming that, women are too emotional to be in charge, but it's men who've been in charge and have started all of the wars. So how does that make any sense? I really don't know. So the idea of being able to communicate more effectively, express emotion more effectively, so it's not acted out through behaviors, personally, I think that is deeply important. So I shared this on social media. It was the late October, early November 2021. I posted this, I think it was not like late at night, sometime later in the evening, like 10:30, 11, that kind of thing. I woke up in the morning to an absolute circus of madness on this social media post. All of the people posting were from this cult-like online business group. Some of them were arguing among themselves. There was one that was a mother and daughter. I say mother and daughter, the mother must have been in her 60s. The daughter, I think, was a similar age to me, and I was 36 at the time. So there was this weird back and forth with them. The mother had positioned herself as like, a women's coach, and the daughter was a qualified psychotherapist. And the funny thing was the just the absolute rant that they were going on and totally going to town on this thing made me think, who the hell would want to be coached by this person? And who in God's name would ever actually go to a therapist who had zero level of control over themselves? And all of this had come from a post about the difficulties of men expressing emotion. It was just so weird. It seemed so abstract. And then, of course, over the day, the thing escalated to a point where I was just so stressed that I ended up having to delete the post because they just wouldn't shut up. Like, they really wouldn't shut up at all. And then the leader of the group, the cult-like business group, made a post on their socials saying about how they were enjoying their clients arguing with each other over social media today. And I mean, that should have been a red flag, and I should have quit there and then. But it was one of these things that when you are in a situation that you enter into through a place of vulnerability, because I joined that group in late 2020, where of course there was a lot of Kool-Aid flying around, but also a lot of desire for people to want to share their ideas with the world, because it seemed like the world was turning a corner and changing, and we could do things a bit differently. There were many sharks in that water claiming to have the ideas or the method or the knowledge, or just being the people who had seen you in a way that others had not. So, of course, as you can imagine, after an experience like that, that pulls you closer into the web if you don't get out. because it was positioned to me that, oh, this is just the normal part of doing things online. And before that, I was doing live videos a few days a week. I was sharing things a lot. I was running a lot of classes. There was a lot of activity. And what I noticed from there is pretty much, I would say 90% of the people who had coalesced around this figure and group were only interested in advancing their own cause. Yet while claiming to be healed and enlightened individuals, but because they had viewed their healing process as linear, they had a hell of a lot more work to do. So it's a funny one. And this was the crazy thing to me, because so many of them were positioning themselves to help others. But when it came to it, they started acting like a bunch of teenagers at best and primary school kids at worst, which actually, as an ex-teacher, is an insult to a lot of children that I've worked with of those ages, who are way more mature and conscientious than any of these people could ever dream to have been. So seeing healing as a linear path is very dangerous, because you're going to be confronted with things that will challenge you over this life. You're going to be confronted with situations that, for better or worse, need you to grow, need you to be more responsive and reflective, and recognize that just because you might be better than you were doesn't mean that it makes how you are okay. So if we're going to shift away from that, we have to recognize that a perspective needs to evolve. So I've got a few thoughts and ideas, because we like lists, it makes it easier, doesn't it, on how we can sort of slip into a better journey of healing, viewing it as an unfolding experience, but also cyclical in nature, and using that analogy of the waves breaking on the shore, so we can actually help evolve through ourselves and through our own journeys. And the first one is, healing is not a race. You got to take as much time as you need. Now, like I said earlier, being mindful of the healing holding pattern and the healing loops, there are going to be things and situations and experiences that you'll work on. You'll integrate them in theory, and then you have to embody them in practice, which is always the hard thing. And sometimes when you're unable to do that, that's where the self accountability comes in, and you need to cut yourself off there and recognize, I'm slipping into an old pattern right now. I am deeply sorry. I just need to take a minute, particularly if this is in an exchange with someone else. Like, think about like your relationships, intimate partners, close connections, this kind of thing, where people can see the vulnerable, unmasked version of you. But also it's recognizing that version of you, but it's also recognizing that that's the version of you where some of the old coping mechanisms and shadow aspects can come out as well. And obviously we'll talk about shadow in more depth another day, but it is relevant here. The next one, so with this, we're allowing ourselves to keep moving through life, keep living, keep moving through the journey, not pulling ourselves away from the world, but also giving ourselves grace that we know that we might fall down, but when we fall down, it's about how we then choose to sort of dust off the situation and carry on, that will define whether there has been a healing taking place there or not. It's definitely not something that you can think, oh yes, I want to have this in place by next month, and then after that I'm going to move forward. Yeah, you can have those foundation stones and tent poles, but ultimately there's always going to be something reminding you, showing you those blind spots, showing the things that have been kept away in ever increasingly nuanced ways. Because if it's like layers of the onion peeling away, it gets subtler to notice, but arguably, like the further we go into the onion, it can get a bit more intense. So the next one is that there is no singular way to solve all of the problems that you may be experiencing in life. You will most likely need different tools and different practitioners for different aspects of your experience. Now, as an ethical practitioner, this is actually one of the ways that I position myself in the practitioner community and in the landscape of personal spiritual development and well-being. So this is as much for the practitioners as it is for the people who would be seeking help with stuff, in that don't be shy to go to the people for certain things that you're drawn to. And then when that experience is done, recognize that while you've done all you can with that person, they might not be able to help you on the next step of the journey. Now, when I was working as a musician and a guitar player full time, a lot of folks would approach this work like there was a scarcity to it. Oh, there's only so many gigs, there's only so many bands, blah, 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 this kind of thing. There's space for everyone. There's always going to be a desire for music. There's always going to be innovations in musical style, technique, and practice. And not everyone is going to know everything. So there has been plenty of times where I've worked with a student for a while and then I've passed them on to someone else because they're like, oh, I really want to learn this style. And it's like, okay, that's not a style that I'm would necessarily consider myself proficient in. Let's have a look at a song or two, and if you want to continue on that stylistic journey, then maybe we'll talk about handover, because you might have a better experience with someone else who's a specialist in that area. This is also one of the reasons why I talk a lot about emotions as how we experience energy as an EFT practitioner, because when we start tapping into how we experience energy in the body and energy in our personal experience and how that affects our perspective of the world, that is a massive area to explore. That is a massive thing to chew on. And it's also something that requires a lot of deep personal reflection. One of the reasons I talk about emotions as energy is in spirituality, people talk about energy in such abstract and faux whimsical ways to make themselves appear more interesting. Emotions as energy is kind of like working class revolution for the spiritual world, because in my view, that's something that can put people in touch with themselves very quickly. They can learn the landscape of how they respond to the world, but they can also recognize how certain things will provoke certain actions and reactions from them from a place of unconsciousness. Then when they come to a consciousness of that, they're free to make different choices. Now, this is something that is relevant at any stage of the journey, but it's also a very specific aspect of it as well. Because when we recognize emotions as how we experience energy, that gives us the ability to control our own energy and to help move the energy in a situation or an experience in a direction that is favorable rather than unfavorable. For me, that is a specialism. And that is not necessarily something everyone might seek, although I personally believe that everyone does actually need to do that work and revisit it from time to time as things evolve and change. We're recognizing there that we're setting up constructs and frameworks for things that can evolve and move. And again, this is something that to me was quite important to avoid the healing. And for me, this is something that was quite important to act as an antidote both to the healing holding pattern and the healing loop. Because with the healing holding pattern, that brings me up to my next point, is that be mindful of creating a spider's web of avoidance. Because with the spider's web of avoidance, there are so many folks out there who've positioned themselves as healing practitioners, and all they ever do is things like releasing retreats or releasing experiences and this kind of thing. They are the release valve, and that is necessary in some situations, but it's also not progressively focused or integrative healing. Because if you're just letting go of a lot of things all of the time, where is the structure and framework to help you not let those things build up in you again? When we get into this spider's web stuff, there is also no agency, there is no autonomy. If a practitioner is not helping someone lay those foundation stones of agency and autonomy, they're not actually healing or helping the person. They're installing themselves as another gateway on the process for that person to access a sense of clarity and peace and connection with those transcendental aspects of themselves. So with that, it can then be very easy to get tied up in what we're supposed to be doing and what we're not supposed to be doing, rather than recognizing the shoulds and shouldn'ts need to come from ourselves. They don't come from other people, because when they come from other people, that is again an exertion of power, dominance, and control over you by someone else, which is the last thing that anybody needs. So we feel trapped, we feel stuck. and anything that challenges that is rejected. Now, like I said, we're living in a responsive world. We're living in a world that is dictated by the lens that we see it through, whether that's at a personal level or a structural level. If we're going to shift the lens, we also have to shift the view of self. And one of the things that can be really challenging is that if you're in the spider's web holding pattern, which I was throughout my 20s, and I've definitely noticed it in some aspects of my 30s as well, when you have that moment when you free yourself from the spider's web, it is ugly. And it's ugly in that you maybe drop to the ground, you have to dust yourself off, but you still have to free yourself from the factors that bind you. So naturally, as ever, the best cure is prevention. But when you find yourself in that, you have to give yourself grace in getting out of it rather than trying to force yourself out of it, because then that could create bad stuff as well. So avoidance is not healing. Avoidance is avoidance. And we need to be so connected with the world. We need to be more in the world, not pulling ourselves away and hiding from it. We need to actually be as present as we can be with ourselves and others and our human experience so we can truly live. And being in the healing holding pattern or the healing loop is not something that allows that to be possible. Next is a big one. You are not the same person after your experiences, and that is okay. You are not supposed to go back to who you were, and it's healthy to grieve that version of yourself. But this is where people can get stuck in anger, resentment, rage, and self-destructive behaviors. Oh, this is a big one. This is such a big one. And before I got into this work, one of the things that I really wanted was to be the old version of myself before I'd experienced all of these difficulties and these various different things. And that vision of like the child self or the young teenage self who before they'd gone through any of that was like very much like, yeah, why can't I be that guy again? But this is where the analogy of tapestry of humanity started to form in my mind, because it helped me to conceptualize of those difficult experiences as these giant single colored balls of yarn tangled onto the front of the tapestry of myself and the tapestry of my life. Now, what that then meant for me was, instead of trying to cut them off or chop them off from the tapestry and there'd just be these loose frayed ends, I thought, well, what about weaving them in? What about weaving them in and letting those particular parts of the tapestry of my life take on deeper color, shade, and texture? Rather than trying to pretend that they didn't happen, recognize that we found a way through it, but we don't have to be defined by it. And it's in that moment that that was a bit of a power shift for me, because then it made me realize, well, not being defined by the experiences also means you're free to create a new version of yourself. You're free to create someone who has navigated these things and come out the other side. And then the biggest testament to strength of character and purity of your own heart is retaining a core version of yourself throughout everything that happens in your life, and recognizing that, you know, we're all going to go through changes, we're all going to have different experiences, but holding on to visions and versions of who we were does not help us on that journey of unfolding and becoming. It's only creating more avoidance, but internally. We're avoiding ourselves, we're avoiding the evolution of ourselves, and we're avoiding the ability to reclaim some personal power in situations that have taken away our agency, autonomy, and empowerment, and these kind of things. So when we look at it like that way, we can see when someone is reactive, again, still acting unconsciously, when anything challenges the journey of their healing so far, versus responsive, that they can speak from a place of power and authority within themselves over their experiences, but they still have an openness when met with a different perspective. Because the idea of having to let a version of yourself go, or a version of yourself has died, that's real hard. You know, you need to grieve that version of you. You need to recognize that that is something and someone who is no longer here through no choice of their own. And, you know, there's no right or wrong way to do it. Only you can make that call. But when you make that call, it is really important to tread that path with confidence in yourself to know that you are becoming someone new and something different. And it's within these things that you give yourself a lot of sense of peace, and you give yourself autonomy to really chart your own vision and course into something new, which I think is a beautiful thing. But that takes bravery. And sometimes bravery means doing a quiet thing, nudging the course of your trajectory slightly, so over time you go in a totally different direction. But that is not possible if we're still trying to get back to that version of ourselves that we wanted to be before things happened. Now, this is also an interesting one, because while I was walking the path, there came a point where I started to feel like the adult version of my childhood self. And I realized then and there that I'd given myself a beautiful gift, because by recognizing that I wasn't going to go back to being the same and trying to approach things from that perspective and weaving those large single colored balls of yarn into the tapestry and recognizing that they can gain depth and texture by doing that and nuance, that allowed that version of myself to emerge. It allowed that version of myself to see that there was a pathway to come back into the fold. And I wasn't expecting that, and I was very grateful when it did, but it also meant that letting go was a very valuable part of that process, because that's what made it possible. And of course, that's arguably one of the most terrifying things, because when you have to let go, you're letting go of parts of yourself, but ultimately you're letting go of the restrictions and constrictive structures that stop them being manifest. And from there, that puts paid to a lot of the self-destructive behaviors as well, because self-destructive behaviors is about self-soothing. And when we're self-soothing, we're trying to deal with that pain and that frustration. And when we recognize that the pain and frustration is a very natural and valid response to that, there is an anger, there is a grief, because the situations may be long past. There isn't anything we can do about it anymore, but we still have to carry the memory. You've got to give yourself grace. You've got to give yourself grace. You've got to be kind to yourself. You've got to be empathetic towards that version of yourself that went through that and did the best that they could do. And when you start to see it unfolding in that way, you do get given the opportunity to start laying the pathway for new ways of being, new ways of doing, new structures, and all of these kind of things, But that requires letting go, which is hard. Letting go of yourself, letting go of an identity that was taken from you, letting go of a version of self that died in the dirt, in the battleground, that you never asked to be part of, but you were drafted into for one reason or another, depending on the situation. So I see you, because I've been there. I wouldn't be talking about it if I hadn't been there. But I'm also not going to be one of those guys who's like, yeah, I did it, so you can do it. Because everyone's different. Everyone responds different. And we need to have these conversations, because we then empower ourselves in the pathway, whatever that pathway is. Now, next one touches on a point that we were discussing last week about spirituality as an addiction. So this is define the difference between what you want to do to relax, enjoy yourself, and have fun versus what you do to self-soothe, divert, distract, and sabotage your progress. Now, this is a funny one for me, because when people go through their healing journey or their awakening, all this kind of thing, they renounce lots of things that were not helpful for them, which is fine, because that's their personal journey. They need to do what they want to do. But then they start shaming others for doing the same thing because they had a bad experience with it. It's projecting the personal onto the universal, because there is no such thing as a universal experience. There is only the personal lens of interpretation and the personal reflections and the personal experience. So, for example, one of the big ones might be, oh, I don't drink anymore since my healing or my awakening. And that then comes from a place of being judgmental rather than a recognition of, I don't do this anymore because it doesn't agree with me. I don't do this anymore because it turns me into someone that I don't like. I don't do this anymore because I feel like I don't have any self-control. And that can literally just mean you have one drink and then you want to have 10. And then before you know it, you're wobbling about and then being bundled into a taxi home and you got a headache for 3 days. That's not good. But that's very different from going out and enjoying a glass of wine with some friends. Maybe, you have a couple of them over the evening and you go, right, thank you very much. Lovely time. I'll catch you later. Because you want to have that social connection or be part of the group, and one of the things that is really hard, being in the UK for one, is the acceptance of alcohol within our culture and how that's become such a cultural touchstone for many, which most social activities revolve around consumption of alcohol, or most people will unwind by having a drink. That is very unhealthy, and I've been in situations and connections, relationships, and whatnot, and I've seen things. I've seen what alcohol does to people. Both my parents are teetotal. My uncle on my dad's side is teetotal as well, because like my granddad, bless him, he did have a bit of a problem with the drink. It was more so that he just couldn't take it, and that would then cause a knock-on effect of difficulty for my uncle and my dad, my grandma, and that kind of thing. So they chose not to do it because of the experience they grew up with. I respect that. That's absolutely fine. But situations like that, it makes sense. You can understand it. But when people are doing it from a place of dogma of like, oh, I don't do that because it lowers your vibration. It lowers their vibration. It lowers their personal experience, but they're painting others with the same brush. They're using that judgment. And that's something I don't have any time for, because you see people who claim to be spiritual, who claim to be awakened, but then they are, dunking on others for their own personal prejudices and trying to template their personal experience onto a universal window. It just doesn't work. The only things I don't have time and respect for are hypocrisy and judgmental people. So there we go. So you need to recognize, where the layers are. You need to recognize that, moderation is okay, but everything in moderation, including moderation itself. Sometimes you might want to let loose and let your hair down. Remember, you're a human being. Go party with your friends. That's absolutely fine. But it's when you're doing these things as an avoidance, you're doing them as a self-soothing. And self-soothing can be anything. Self-soothing can be food. It can be playing games. It can be anything, truly. Anything that is causing that diversion from you focusing on what you want to be doing and sharing with your world and in your life and all of this stuff, versus things that might just be a bit of a release and a connection point. It's very important to recognize what position and place these things have in your life, and don't necessarily cut things off because someone else says you have to. Maybe if you don't want to do something, then don't do it. If you do want to do something, then do it, but then don't give yourself shame about it, is what I'm trying to say here, because that's how we get stuck in the healing holding pattern and the healing loop, rather than recognizing that, everything has its place. Everything has its value, but not everything is going to be relevant to everyone. So yeah, don't get hung up on enjoying yourself, but be mindful if you create excuses to go and enjoy yourself, rather than actually doing things more consciously and in a measured way, so you don't make a tit of yourself. All right, so this brings me to the next one. Do not offer space or openness to those who benefit from your being quiet about your experience. The hand that hit you is not the hand that heals you. So this is a big one, because the example I'm going to give for this is getting out of a cult-like group and then having a number of people from said group who claim to be my friend try to rally round me to support, as they claimed, whereas actually they just wanted me to shut up. What is interesting to me is how so many people became invested in making sure I kept everything to myself. And I couldn't do that if I was going to recover from the experience, because when I was in this group, there was a lot of things that went down that when I look back on them, I just think, what on earth? What on earth was going on there? What was that about? And I left the group not because of anything that happened to me, but because of how it was treating other people. And for me being there and being part of that, it was like me saying that was okay. even though I wasn't involved, but still being connected. To me, that was more than enough and too close for comfort. So with that and that recognition that they only wanted me to keep quiet, and then of course one of the most hilarious PR campaigns to try and make sure that everyone saw the group and its main figures in a favorable light taking place, rather than actually having conversations that bring a sense of accountability and openness, because no one actually wanted to listen to everyone, because no one actually wanted to listen. They were only curious about, what do you think about they're only curious about what I thought and felt about the leader. I couldn't give a crap personally. I was more like, I just wanted to kind of go back on my own way and bring my work back into the world. But because of this manipulation, control, and coercion, and outright, in my view, bullying in some cases, that then pushed me into a journey that I've only really just come out of in the past couple of months. So it's been like a 2-year journey, over which course my long-term relationship broke down as well, which I know that had an effect on that as well, because when you feel like you can't talk about something, you keep it to yourself and you withdraw from everyone, you withdraw from your support mechanisms and systems and networks and people, and you think that there's something wrong with you, because it's further abuse, it's further harm being done. And when we recognize that, that is a power move in itself, because we draw the line, we don't let people back in, but we also recognize that anyone or anything that benefits from you being in a state of pain is not anyone or anything that you need in your life. Because people who do thrive on that, there's a special place in the fiery pit for them, because they think the world revolves around them and everything has to conform to their expectation. No, it doesn't. So yeah, be mindful of that, because I know that there will be certain situations where, say, like if a relationship's broken down and you go and talk with each other, and there can be opportunities for healing there, but that's not going to be possible if someone starts trying to mess with your head and play with your emotions. It could be possible if someone is leading with self-accountability, but that is rare. So you have to use your best judgment on that. But leading with that idea of, well, the hand that hit me is not going to be the hand that heals me, has saved me a lot of problems, particularly in recent years, because previously I used to be a bit of a fawner and would fawn over people and try to get things okay. Now it's like, whatever, you've got your ideas, you can live with those, that's fine. I know what's happened in my perspective. So yeah, that's a very, very different strategy to take, that once you recognize that you don't have to give space or airtime to those folks. The next one, you can't change others, you have to focus on yourself. This is a big one. Now, one of the things that I don't like about the term triggering, as someone who, it has been said by a doctor that I have CPTSD, is that triggering is a very specific process and experience and a series of chemical reactions and responses in the body. It's not getting upset at something that you saw online. It's not freaking out because someone used a word that you don't like. This is where we see that shadow side of people trying to control the world and distort reality, because they're in the healing holding pattern. They've not actually moved through their things, and their structure of their world falls apart very easily because someone has said something that they don't agree with or that they don't like. That's not being triggered. That's just having no inner emotional structure. And sometimes, you can be a bit of an ass with this kind of thing. So I ain't into that. And when we recognize that we have to bring our attention back to ourselves, we start to focus on building a bit of strength, a bit of resilience. People take this idea of resilience to the nth degree. But let me ask you a question. If you're going to go out on the open water in a boat, wouldn't you like your boat to be appropriate for the task at hand? So you're going to go out in the lake, you might need a small boat. That's fine. You're going to go out in the ocean, you're going to need something that's seaworthy. You're going to go into uncharted, unstable waters, maybe a conflict zone, metaphorically. You're going to need the ability to defend yourself. or, make moves as appropriate. You're not going to go out in the middle of the Atlantic in a rowing boat because that's totally unfit for the purpose. And one of the frustrations that I see is a frustration at myself from about 20 years ago. And when I was in the first significant course of therapy while I was at uni, I said to my therapist, I feel like I'm in the ocean in a rowing boat sometimes, rolling all over the place. And she's like, well, wouldn't you prefer to be in a battleship? And I was like, well, yeah, I would. I would, because I understood in that moment that it wasn't about trying to control the sea. It was about knowing how to navigate the waves in a personal vessel that was appropriate for the task. And so many are forgetting that. They are forgetting that because with individualist mentality and culture, believing that the world is supposed to revolve around individuals rather than people being part of the collective is a very, very difficult idea and a very, very difficult concept that does not help anyone. It just keeps people in the holding pattern. And then you're then in this situation where conversations become like laser tripwires and you don't know what to say. I'm not saying going out there and intentionally trying to provoke people, because I think that is one of the worst things about our current culture, is this idea that people get validation by supposedly triggering others. It's like, you didn't trigger them, you just annoyed them. And if you take pleasure from annoying other people intentionally to upset them and frustrate them, then you are a dickhead. Like, there is no other way about that. So it's being mindful. But when we recognize that we can focus all of that energy back on ourselves and that intention back on ourselves and take those actions to support ourselves, we're then not so hung up if someone says or does something that challenges us. It's more like, oh, I don't really like that, but maybe I don't need to jump in all guns blazing on this one. People could really save themselves a lot of heartache and difficulty by doing that. And also, we could actually have a lot more progress in the world because we're not arguing the semantics. We're not arguing over trying to get people to conform to a very personal vision of the world that is based on the avoidance of pain and the shadow of personal difficulty. Next one. You most likely won't get the closure you want or need from the other party, so you have to find that closure within yourself. This is a big one. So as someone that works as a reader, a lot of the time when I have people coming to me that they've had relationships broken down, they're hoping to get some kind of conversational clarity from the other person, but I find myself being in that position to offer that clarity, or at least best as I can, because closure comes from moving on. Closure comes from choosing to carry on your life. Closure comes from you making choices for you and seeing them through and acting upon them in a way that is constructive, productive, powerful, and positive. So it's a bit of a shift there, but you recognize that, you're giving yourself that space and that openness. And over time, the version of you that was in that connection, again, gets woven into the tapestry, ceases to exist. When I think back on relationships and I think, well, the version of me that was in that relationship is not the version of me that I am. And that personal evolution has been the closure. That idea to carry on my own journey has been the closure. And there were times in the past where I felt like I was trying to have those conversations of closure, but it came across to me like the other person was just trying to influence how I saw them. So now I'm like, I just leave it. I just leave. I'm not interested, because if we've got to that point where things have totally broken down, we're choosing to move ahead onwards and forwards, and I'm going to deal with my things on my own time. I'm going to deal with my feelings in my own way. I've been like, it's at time of recording, it's just over 11 months since the breakup of a 6.5 year relationship. There's still stuff that's coming up for me for that. But it's like, am I going to bother my ex with that? No. I made a commitment to me, an agreement to me, that I said I'm not going to do anything to make this person moving on in their life difficult, challenging, or whatever. With any relationship, people should be free to go at any time, even if it is upsetting. But the things that have been coming up have been challenging. There has been moments where I felt like I can't really do much because I'm quite overcome with these things. But for me, the decision to keep moving forward, the decision to keep going and doing my thing and really generating as much heat around that as possible is the closure, because I was not able to do that before. Not that it was their fault, let me make that very clear, but because of the tapestry of circumstances that had just evolved over that period of time. And it is a bit bittersweet, because when you're building a future and you have someone else in mind that's going to be part of that future, you kind of have to grieve that timeline of the future not coming into manifestation, well, at least not for this version of me anyway. For another version of us out there, absolutely, I'm sure, going from strength to strength, and more power to them. But if that future is built upon a vision and a dream and an ambition that you have, you can't give up on that. And that for me was the challenge, because for a while I just felt like, I don't want to do this. I don't want to do this because it feels hollow, and that took me a few months. It took me a few months to kind of come back into myself and be able to be of service to others, and just kind of hanging on by my fingernails in the meantime. But, I wasn't going to get the closure from that situation that I needed from anyone else other than myself. And that closure has come through personal development, personal transformation. I went to therapy for 6 months, pretty much as soon as it was clear that this was a final thing. I registered to, see a therapist, because I thought I need to take accountability of my end of all of this. And so I can reflect on what has gone wrong, what's my part in that, and how can I learn from that and grow from that. So if anything is like part of a pattern, which of course, we're humans, we live in patterns, I don't want that then to feed out into the next thing and for the next person to be affected by things that have nothing to do with them. So when we seek closure internally, it's much more of a power move rather than thinking the other person's going to have to give something. Because ultimately in those conversations, you're going to see things from such a different point of view that the likelihood is going to be that one of you gets angry or one of you gets upset. You don't want that. You want to try and have positive energy as much as you can. And sometimes the way to have that positive energy is to close the door and deal with things yourself. So going into that mindset and that mode is the most important thing that you can do to get closure from something and get the right support that you need to navigate it and deal with that, rather than falling into, the self-destructive path or conflict or anything like that. If you've had a long-term partner and the relationship breaks down, you've not cheated on each other, no one's, there's no abuse in the relationship, anything, it's just not working. Why the hell would you then want to create a situation where there is conflict, manufactured conflict? You might not agree with everything. You might look back on the relationship differently. But at the time, you're like, no, do you know what? If I've said that I love this person, like once upon a time, I'm still going to, in a way, in testament to that, honor that and recognize that as I move forward, I'm going to focus on the present and the future. And if things might come up in the past, as you get any of the grief, you have the frustration, we'll find creative ways to channel that, positive ways to channel that. But I'm not going to bother them with it, because I know that they wouldn't bother me with it as well, because that's not how they work. So it's the recognition of that, and it's the recognition of you have to go through your own process. Because if you're waiting on closure from the other person, or like an apology, or something like that, you will wait a long time. I remember that there was a situation with a step parent, and I said to my parent that was involved, I was like, I feel like I need an apology from them. And I waited for that apology for years, and it never came, still hasn't. And then that made me think, well, what can I do? Well, I can forgive that version of myself, but as a lot of it happened when I was a teenager and still a child, legally, mentally, physically, and spiritually, there's not much I can do about that. The only thing I can do is not be like that myself. So again, that was a closure in that situation, because ultimately what you don't want is to be in a position where you're holding the bag. You don't have to carry the bag when something breaks down. You don't have to be the one who keeps the memory alive by doing that. You're only living in the past and causing yourself pain and stopping life moving forward, because life always has motion to it. So that brings me to the next one. Healing is nuanced and ongoing, but you don't need to use it as a distraction for getting out there and living. Some people are addicted, in a sense, to healing and don't actually go out and live. And living is where healing ends, in that you reconnect with the world from a new perspective. So I think this, this very much refers to like the healing holding patterns and loops, where people are tied up in that web of, oh, I can't do that, I can't do this because I'm healing right now. It's all right. You got to do what you got to do, but just remember, you got to get off the bus at some point and get back into the world. And it's challenging, because I think when someone's on that process and that journey, it's a very vulnerable time. It's a very difficult time and a challenging time, because you've still got to go out into the world. You still got to do all your things. But in that personal state, needing connection while you're healing is key, because otherwise you can get more isolated. You can disappear further into the cloud, and we don't want that either. We want to make sure that we are able to keep moving, evolving, and flowing. So it's recognizing what you're doing and how that can help you, and then where the cutoff points are, is one of the most important things that I could stress about this thing. I do think that we covered this point quite a lot earlier in the episode, talking about the loops and the holding patterns, but it is worth mentioning again, because not seeing healing as a one and done thing is the most important thing, because then you have to have those dialogues with yourself. If something comes up and challenges you in a way that is like, this is not right, there's going to be those moments. You don't need to make a big deal about it. You just need to check in with yourself, because you're stopping that unconscious reaction rather than a conscious response. And it's that internal personal maintenance that we need to recognize is part of the journey. So we don't need to turn it into a big deal, but it is really important that we don't stay stuck in the holding pattern or the loop of healing as a result, because then life doesn't move forward. We don't progress, we don't evolve, we don't grow, and we're still living under the shadow of what happened, even if the actions that we're taking are on the opposite side of the pendulum swing. If it's on the pendulum swing, it's still influencing us. Next point. This is the penultimate one. Healing happens in stages. You immerse, you integrate experience. You'll notice new boundaries and margins through your interactions with life and others. Yeah, again, this feeds into the previous point, because ultimately, how can you say you've done the work if you don't put it to the test? Humans have got obsessed with this intellectualization of everything. We're turning everything into thoughts. Everything is about mindset. Everything is about rewiring the mind, or some CBT bullshit. We are much more rounded beings than that, and we process and experience the world in such a different way from one person to the next, that when we have those interactions with others after we've been on that journey for certain stages or points and processes, we're allowing ourselves to really recognize how far we've come, how we've evolved, all of these kind of things. There is no sweeter experience than recognizing that something doesn't trigger you anymore. I had that when I was living in that holding pattern in my 20s. There was just some things I couldn't watch on TV. There was some conversations I just couldn't have. Everything became about avoidance. And then suddenly I realized one day that I was, without realizing, forcing others to engage in some kind of laser tripwire tap dance around things that would trigger me or not. And a lot of them were not even in my conscious awareness. So I think I took about, I think it was maybe like a 2-year journey or something on that one, to really get into under the skin of that and try and understand where a lot of this was coming from, so that wouldn't happen again. But again, like I say, it's not linear, it's in stages. But then when you start to recognize the impulses and the responses that you get from different stimulus, that gives you that sense of freedom. But again, that is you putting it to the test. That's not you then holding everyone else around you hostage, whether you mean to or not, as to what your triggers may and may not be. Because again, you don't know it if you don't embody it. And you can't embody it if you don't give yourself the chance to embody it. So Give yourself the chance to embody it, please. The final one is healing is about facilitating the becoming of yourself. So again, this brings me back to the idea of weaving those threads into the tapestry of the experiences that have been difficult, been challenging, that we don't like, and all these kind of things, but also recognizing that there are so many gifts that we can give to ourselves, and recognize that humans don't have a shelf life. We're here until we finish the human experience and cross on over to the next thing. That's the real expiration date. You do anything at any age, until you're in the ground, you've still got time. The important thing is that you allow that to happen. And when you're in the healing holding pattern or the healing loop, time just tends to stand still. If you're not out there and living, things aren't moving, things aren't flowing, the process is being held up. So you've got to give yourself that ability to do that and give yourself grace on that journey, because we're always different people throughout our lives. You've got to enjoy it as you go. And, some of them are good, some of them are bad, most of them are in between. A lot of life happens more on the middle of the road than it does in the margins, that's for sure, lest the internet would have us believe something different. And if you're not facilitating that becoming of yourself, this is a big problem. This is a real big problem, because from there, you are still locked into old versions and patterns and viewpoints. And that's something that stops you bringing the best of yourself to the table. We want to be our best selves. We want to be the unfolding self, the becoming self. We're always moving, we're always growing, we're always flowing. Life has movement. Stagnation does not move. Stagnation ultimately leads to the opposite of life, which, do I need to say it? So make sure that your process, the people that you're working with, are supporting you in becoming yourself. They're supporting your agency, supporting your autonomy. They are facilitating you growing from one stage and process to the next. Otherwise, it's just the holding pattern. It's just the loop. So when we start to view it like this, we can see healing as waves rolling up on the shore. One wave will carry something of the wave before it, but will also carry something of the wave coming after it. And the more we immerse in the process, the more we become conscious of what is in the waves, so we can take them out and they don't just keep dredging up the same old stuff. So thank you for joining me for this week's episode of The Big Soup. My name is Alistair Ballantyne. If you would like to work with me and have my support on your personal journey of becoming, feel free to visit my website at www.alistairballantyne.com, where you can see the list of different ways that I can support you on your journey of becoming yourself. It has been a pleasure, as always. I send you my love. I send you my gratitude. Thank you for enjoying this bowl of the big soup. And if you enjoy this podcast, share it with your friends. Spread the word. I send you my love and my gratitude once again. Catch you soon.